To the Minnesota Stormwater Seminar Series. I am John Gulliver, and I will introduce this series and our speaker today. This series is co-sponsored by the Water Resources Center and the St. Anthony Falls Laboratory, both at the University of Minnesota, and funded by the Stormwater Research Council, which is also from Minnesota. So our speaker today is Chris Kloss, the Director of Water Permits Division at the US EPA. As director since 2020, Chris is responsible for overseeing the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System Program. That's the NPDES program. And this includes collaborating with 10 regional EPA offices and oversight of 47 authorized NPDES programs requiring extensive outreach to utilities, municipalities, industrial stakeholders, and the NGO community. As a side job, he also is responsible for programs related to integrated planning. Sounds like a pretty big job to me. Green infrastructure, another big job. And animal agriculture, oh my goodness, that is a big job. So he has a few other responsibilities. Chris has been at the US EPA office for 14 years, working with MS4s in the stormwater program and as a team lead in the green infrastructure program. He also oversaw $4 million in community-based technical assistance to aid in green infrastructure implementation, integrated plan development, and long-term stormwater planning. Before employment at the EPA, Chris worked as a stormwater consultant with three companies, the Low Impact Development Center, McCrone Incorporated, and Eastern Research Group. So he has been on both sides of these prevalent issues that he's going to talk about today. Chris received a Biological Resources Engineering bachelor's degree from the University of Maryland, an MS in Civil and Environmental Engineering from the Virginia Tech, and a second master's of Public Management in Environmental Policy from the University of Maryland. So today, Chris is going to talk about emerging policy issues in stormwater management. So it is my pleasure to welcome Chris Kloss.
All right, I think I'm green and live. All right. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for having me this morning. I really appreciate the opportunity to be up here today. I want to start off by thanking Andy, John, and John for the great hospitality that they've shown to me in just scheduling me to get up here and just while I've been here the past 2 days. And really wanted to thank them for the opportunity to come and talk to you all and all the folks online. As John said, I've been at EPA since 2011. The entire time I've been in the NPDES program in various roles. So I've worked on permitting issues the entire time I've been in EPA. And then the 7 years before that, the Low Impact Development Center, working for Neil Weinstein, I was doing stormwater and green infrastructure work. So for the past 20 years, in one way or another, I've had a foothold in stormwater. So I'm always happy to come and talk about that, even though our portfolio is a little bit bigger than that. And glad to have the opportunity to do that this morning. One of the things I wanted to comment on was John and Andy gave me a tour of the facility yesterday. Honestly, I had no appreciation for how large this facility is when you walk in. And then you go down 3 or 4 levels into, they don't call it the bunker, but it feels like that when you get down below and you have all the limestone and the native stone down there. And as they were talking over their research projects, it really reminded me of, I started in the stormwater about 20 years ago, how much has changed in the last 2 decades and how much we still have to learn and how much research is still going on. And I think one of the challenges we have as a science-based regulatory agency is being adaptive enough to accommodate this new research as it is ongoing. And that's one of the challenges that we have is implementing a program, but then realizing in real time we get new information about what are the best practices, what works, how do we combine these systems, and how do we address some of the challenges that we maybe anticipated 20 years or years ago and some that we didn't have any information about at the time. So I wanted to start a little bit just to give you a sense of where stormwater sits in our regulatory program. And I like to start actually at the Clean Water Act of 1972, because I think that piece of legislation, which it governs all the work that we do. I'm not a lawyer, but I call it one of the most optimistic pieces of legislation that I've seen. And I say that for one of the reasons was it put a lot of faith in technology and progress. So when you read the Clean Water Act, one of the things that really strikes me is, although for generations we had been throwing things away in our rivers and waterways and just thinking of that as our disposal system, when they wrote how we would interact with our waterways, they were deliberate about the language they chose. And Congress chose to say it was unlawful for any person to discharge any pollutant unless it was authorized by the Act. And one of the ways you get authorized by the Act is through Section 402, which is the NPDES program. So even though we had this historical practice of just dumping all our sewage and debris and whatever into the rivers, they recognize that our waterways are a common property that belongs to all of us, and that if you were going to discharge something, you needed permission to do it, and that's where the permitting program came into place. So we've been implementing the NPDES program for 50 years. And over that time, we now have about 1 million permittees across the country. And that's largely permits that are written by the states. As you can imagine, most of those are general permits, not individual permits. Individual permits are less than 10%. Just the numbers work that way. And then when you look at our portfolio of stormwater, it's about 1/3 of the permittees, and that's across municipal, industrial, and construction being the largest of that. The unique thing about stormwater is, you all know, was for the first 15 years, we weren't really sure it was a point source or not, because that's what the NPDES regulates. And in '87, Congress clarified that stormwater was, in fact, a point source and needed to be regulated. And so it came under the umbrella of the NPDES program. And the way it worked out was we gave you great certainty, especially around MS4s. Sometimes it's in, sometimes it's not, and it could be a point source or non-point source. It just depends on the definitions of how we designate. So that's kind of how the regulatory program works. But Congress directed us that that we were going to regulate our phase 1 communities immediately, which was about 3 years after the '87 amendments, and that was the large MS4s and industrial stormwater. And then they directed us to do a study in the '90s that asked us to look at what other MS4 sources needed to be regulated, which was the phase 2 program, and we pegged that to the census definition of urbanized areas, with giving the state some authority to designate other communities within the states as well. So today, phase 1 started in 1990, phase 2 was '99. And although we have a broad portfolio of stormwater, I'm going to focus most of my comments today on the MS4 program, because like all good things, it started in the '90s, and that's where we're going to go and take this journey from. So the first thing I wanted to talk about, I wanted to start with some of the challenges that we're facing, I think, that are some of the most pressing issues that are in front of us today in the stormwater community. And I want to start with what we're calling pollutants of emerging concern. And at the bottom of the screen, we have just launched a new website that provides information on 5 of these. And it's PFAS, 6-PPD, microplastics, personal care products, and PAHs. Today, I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into PFAS and 6-PPD because these are things that are taking up a lot of our time right now. I think one of the unique things about stormwater, as opposed to some of the other dischargers that we have to regulate, is almost every pollutant imaginable is in stormwater. We don't really see that with other industries. We can micro-target some of the pollutants that they're discharging, identify the treatment technologies that remove those pollutants. Stormwater, we've got everything from what would be considered maybe mundane, but trash is still a huge problem. Our first PSA on trash was in 1971, and we still are struggling with how to manage trash, and especially plastics that become microplastics, which end up in the ocean. So there's a lot of work around that. But today I wanted to focus on these 2 because there's been some push from Congress in the bill legislation to address emerging contaminants, and these are 2 that we're looking at. So for PFAS, the agency in 2021 adopted a whole of agency approach for addressing PFAS. So it's literally almost every office that we have that's looking at PFAS. The Office of Water co-chairs an internal agency work group for us, and it really focuses on our clean water program. Obviously, the drinking water program also plays a role, but there are a lot of actions going on in the clean water program. Our sister office is doing some work developing effluent guidelines for the industries that actually use PFAS. So right now we've got PFAS manufacturers. They're going to start an effluent guideline on landfills and also metal finishers. We've identified about 12 industries across the country that either manufacture or use that we want to get as far upstream as we can. And that's been the agency's thesis for this entire time, is we recognize there's a lot of PFAS in the environment, and we want to hold those folks that manufacture or use it, make them treat it as far upstream as we possibly can. We also have been working on aquatic life criteria and public health criteria as well. Those two pieces eventually get rolled into our permits. Those are the two things that are bread and butter permits. If we've got a tech-based standard, or if we have water quality criteria, that's how we generally write our permits. We realize that's going to take years for the science to kind of play out and get adopted in the states on the water quality side. So in 2022, we put out a memo that talked about how we could use the NPDES program one day to do that, but also be proactive, how we could start addressing PFAS now using the tools that we have. And we also have just finalized a multi-validated lab method, 1634, for PFAS sampling. That's in 8 different media, so wastewater, biosolids. We have been encouraging people to use that method to test for PFAS for a while. What we've done on the MS4 side is really focus on where AFFFs have been used. And really incorporating best management practices to limit their use and exposure. So we are very pro putting out fires when we need to. So we want people to use the AFFFs until there's the fluorine-free foams come into use. The F3s, I think, will be coming online soon-ish. But we encourage folks that when they're doing training and other things to use other products as opposed to the AFFFs. And if they have to use them, try to mitigate those as quickly as possible. So if you look at our memo on the MS4 side, that's where we have really focused our energies, is that preventative piece. We have now started incorporating some sampling requirements into some of our MS4 permits as well. And we do this, and there's a lot of talk in the industry, and you'll hear from some other folks maybe on the panel today that talk about passive receivers of PFAS, and we recognize that. All the public utilities, they're not manufacturing it. PFAS is pretty ubiquitous now, and it's ending up in our stormwater systems. The reason we encourage sampling, and we're putting it in our permits, is so we can identify where it is. Do you have hotspots in your system? Is it constant levels? Where might you have legacy soils, or just what we've seen at some military installations is it's collected in the sewer system and slowly bleeds out. We're still very much at an information gathering point of this, that it's not for compliance purposes. We have said in various ways that we don't hold MS4s responsible for this, but we do know that they're a conduit for the discharge. So you'll see more of that from us, and we're encouraging people to get that information so we can use it. I also did want to highlight our industrial stormwater permit, because we'll be putting that out for public comment soon. Our 2021 MSGP, the multi-sector general permit, we did include some mention of PFAS at the time, and we very much focused on housekeeping and best management practices. So we talked about good housekeeping, material storage, keeping it away from stormwater and rainwater, and when necessary, runoff treatment of that. So you'll see that as guidance that accompanies, it's in the fact sheets for the MSGP. We have a plan to propose the next round of the MSGP by late this year, and we are taking a look at some of the PFAS requirements and things that we might need to do to plus those up, because industrial stormwater is a little bit different than the MS4s, and we think there are a lot of facilities that may need to do more than what we're looking at on the MS4s. So switching to 6-PPD, I think this is getting more familiarity, whereas PFAS has been a slow burn over several decades. 6-PPD kind of popped up within the last 4 or 5 years, I would say. This was something we have a person on our team, Heather Goss, that works on transportation issues, and she brought this, gave us a briefing on it probably around 2020 and said, hey, we're starting to see some stuff in the data here, especially in the Pacific Northwest, and the acute toxicity that this has for coho salmon. This is a byproduct of tires. It's 6-PPD is put in tires as a preservation agent. When it comes off the tires and it oxidizes, it turns into the byproduct 6-PPD quinone. That is what's toxic to the coho salmon. Obviously, a very critical species for that geographic region of the world and for tribes up that way. So we are also co-leading a work group on that with our Office of Research and Development, doing a lot of work seeing, is it just that particular species? Where else in the country this may have import for aquatic systems? And partly, again, similar to PFAS, where we have kind of interim measures and long-term goals in mind, The good news about 6-PPDQ is that bioinfiltration can effectively remove it. So if we strategically place some of those systems in place, we can reduce those levels before it gets to receiving streams. But with so many things stormwater, eventually we probably have to get to source control and product substitution. And that's one of the things that the agency writ large is taking a look at. We did get a petition from several tribes to our Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics to have them take a look at this under the Toxic Substances Control Act. And so they've initiated a rulemaking that, if finalized, would require industry to provide a lot more information to us. And we may initiate a rulemaking to gather additional information for us as we go along. You know, this is one of those things that when you look at it is one of the challenges of stormwater, right? In tires, 300 million cars in the country. I'm going to do quick math for you. That's over 1 billion tires just on passenger vehicles. You know, that's a long burn to change those out as we get there. So, you know, there's a lot of things that, you know, we need to consider as we go down that path. And so that's just 2 of the stormwater contaminants that we're taking a look at that have emerged and are challenges and difficult, present some problems. Again, on PFAS, I like to say that's a big Brita filter in a lot of cases. Activated carbon, ion exchange, some of the literature is showing that that's highly effective at treating it. But, you know, in a diffuse environment like stormwater and not knowing the concentrations that we have, especially coming now that we know it's in rain, it's hard to know exactly how that plays out in the MS4 world. All right, so I wanted to switch to another challenge that we have. And so, you know, in the MS4 program, our primary focus and our authorities are around water quality. And it's interesting, when I look back over the presentation last night, I realized that the next series of challenges that I'm going to give are not necessarily water quality specific like those early contaminants are. But obviously, if we're running a wet weather program, climate change is something that's going to have a big impact on it. So EPA just released their 5th climate change indicator report. So this is the impacts that we're seeing now. It's not future projections, it's things that we're seeing. And this is the temperature portfolio that we're seeing around the country. And just about everywhere, we're seeing temperature increases. And so these are how we're mapping them out. And then obviously you all know that if we see temperature increases, we see precipitation increases. Warmer air can hold more moisture. So we're seeing increases in the rainfall that we're getting, not only in annual amounts, but also in intensity. So this is something that we're taking a look at. NOAA, there'll be a couple of slides in here derived from NOAA. They do a great job with data and presenting data that we look at to see what we should be thinking about. So here in Minnesota, since the turn of the 20th century, I think there's been about a 3-degree increase in average annual temperature, and that's been corresponding with the 3.5-inch increase in annual rainfall. And that portfolio of rainfall, similar to a lot of the rest of the country, comes in a little bit more intense storms than the steady storms that we've seen over the history that we've been building our infrastructure largely since the middle of the 20th century. So the infrastructure we have now is not really designed for the rain portfolio that we're seeing moving forward. So how do we think about this in the permitting context, and especially when we do our wet weather permitting? So we've been working on an internal guidance for our EPA permit writers that we are intending to put out by the end of this year. And it really looks at how these changes in precipitation should affect the way we write permits. So while some parts of the country are getting a lot wetter, some are getting drier. So we just updated our low flow handbook. When we do water quality based effluent limits, some of that's based on the 7Q10, the low flow of the stream, the assimilative capacity in the stream. If we have lower flows, that's going to change some of the math that we do around those flows. We also updated our thermal discharges handbook. Same thing. If you have temperature influence discharges and different characteristics in your receiving stream, that's going to change the way we write permits as well. And then we also have coalesced around this term best available data. We have historically used historical precipitation data to develop some of these permits. We don't think that's going to be a good indicator of the rainfall patterns that we're seeing in the future. So where we have more current data, where we have data that's projecting forward, we want to use those data instead of the backward-looking data, because we think that's going to be critical, not only to the performance of the infrastructure, but the sizing of the infrastructure and the resiliency that's inherent in anything moving forward. So how does that impact the existing infrastructure that we have? So since the mid-90s, we put a lot of focus on our combined sewer system. So that's the immediate cousin of the MS4 program. So we have about 750 CSO communities around the country. And when we look at the data, what we've seen is that 90% of those communities have seen an increase in rainfall over the past 30 years. And what we think is that by 2035, the average increase in annual rainfall is going to be 5%. That is coming in more frequent, and the intensity of those rain events are increasing between 5 and 10% across those communities. So what we designed as very static systems back in the day are going to see some increased stresses. So how do we manage those systems to maintain the performance that communities have worked very hard to achieve moving forward? The other thing that we see is about 100 of those communities have discharges that are coastally influenced. So with sea level rise, we think that 100 of those communities are going to have impacts from sea level. One of the great things about the Clean Water Program is we make a lot of use of gravity, right? So we've positioned a lot of our assets in low-lying areas, and we rely on gravity to drain them. But 1/7 of our communities might have instances where if we have impacts of sea level rise, those systems are not going to perform as they were intended. That results in backflow, back surges, that water's got to go somewhere. We may have more basement backups. When we look at what folks have coalesced around calling sunny day flooding, where I am in the mid-Atlantic in Maryland, when you hear about sunny day flooding, they typically mention a few communities, Miami being one, Norfolk being another. Annapolis, Maryland is one, where it doesn't have to rain necessarily. It could be tidally influenced, but what NOAA has found is that since 2000, the incidence of sunny day floods have gone up by 5 days a year. And what they project is that by mid-century, that number will be 45 days a year of sunny day flooding. So that's almost once a week that we're going to have flooding that's induced, that's not rain-induced or storm-induced. It's just going to be the way it kind of progresses. So I pulled the clip at the bottom from the city of Annapolis. So when we're talking about MS4 systems, when they talk about urban flooding, they identify at the very bottom there that the MS4 system becomes a conduit for that flooding. So I happened to be in downtown Annapolis on last month when at that point, Tropical Storm Debbie was making its way up the mid-Atlantic, and parts of downtown Annapolis were flooding. You could walk around the city dock because it was not coming over the dock or the seawall there. It was in pockets in the MS4 that it was then kind of regurgitating up into the city streets. So you can kind of walk around, and Annapolis does have flooding over the city dock at times, but I think we're going to see more and more of this. So if you couple that flooding with days where it does happen to rain, where does that water go, and what's the performance we expect of our MS4 systems? That day and last month happened to be the 8th highest flood stage, and it wasn't raining that day, by the way. That was just the winds blowing the bay into the Severn River and kind of backing that water up. We had the 3rd highest elevation flood in January of this year. So we're starting to see some of these more extreme events more frequently. So then what we also know is that these impacts are not evenly distributed. Some of our communities experience them at greater magnitude than others. So what another office has done, our Office of Environmental Justice, and has put out a report back in 2021 that looked at the climate vulnerability assessment of certain communities. Let me see. Yeah, wanted to make sure I was on the right pace here. So what we have found in this report is that underserved communities and communities of color are more likely to move into neighborhoods that are at high risk for flooding. And that in the Midwest here, minority communities are 8% more likely to live in communities that flood at a greater risk, and those without a high school diploma are a 10% greater probability of living in communities that also flood at a higher frequency. So when we think about how we build our infrastructure, the performance of that infrastructure, what we know is that there's disproportionate impacts. And this also, we did a tree assessment, and I'll weave this all together back at the end, talking about trees as well. But when we look at the data, what we can see is that communities that were formerly redlined have many fewer trees than communities that weren't. And when you look at that based on economic indicators, those communities that have the lowest levels of poverty within them have 2 times the number of trees per person than communities that have higher levels of poverty. And that corresponds to 6 degrees of lower temperature. Now, there's a lot of things at play there, you know, suburban versus urban development, but how we've invested in communities over time is kind of showing itself a little bit in tree cover and some of the benefits that trees provide. And it's just something that we have front of mind when we think about what are the right type of solutions for communities that maybe we haven't historically invested in over time as well, and how we mix the stormwater approaches that we have. One of the other challenges that always comes up is funding. And this is relatively hot off the presses. We just released our Clean Watersheds Needs Survey. This is a somewhat frequent look that we have at the capital needs of the clean water sector. And this is the first year, and I know some in the room will rightly say that we're probably undercounting a lot of this, but there's what we reported on, and the folks that did this got really great response rates. Every state, almost every, I think even all the territories for stormwater, the only state we didn't get was Hawaii. But what it's showing is that stormwater needs are 20% of the overall cost. That's $630 billion in need that we have. So this is quite a significant amount of need that's out there. And for stormwater, this was quite an increase. The last time it was reported, these are 2022 data we just released this year. The last time we had it was 2012 data. The need for stormwater was 25 billion at that time. The increase, I think there are more stormwater needs, but obviously I think there was a lot of outreach done by a lot of groups to get better reporting of that information. But those needs grew. Increases of in impervious surface, increases in rainfall, and just better outreach were the 3 things that we identified for that increase. So there's one way to look at costs, and that's the capital needs that we have. The other is the embedded costs that are things that we pay for all the time, but we don't necessarily think about. These graphics are borrowed from NOAA. And while we think about, and these aren't necessarily related to stormwater themselves, but it's something that influences how we think about infrastructure. So since 1980, NOAA's been tracking billion-dollar disasters that occur each year. And since 1980, there have been about 400 events that have exceeded $1 billion of recovery costs. And those dollars have been adjusted to current dollars. So that's almost $3 trillion in costs. Back during the 1980s, the decade of the 1980s, there was about 3 of these events a year that exceeded $1 billion. The last 3 years, the average is 22 events that exceeded $1 billion. There's, again, a lot of factors at play there, more development, more high-value assets in some of these areas. But these are costs that are embedded in their societal costs that we have to pay to recover, right? There are costs that we pay, and then we also have to think about, as we build infrastructure, as we address climate change, where are the cost trade-offs and what do we want to enhance to help address some of these things. And then one of the examples that I like to show, just because it's intriguing to me, this is the Outer Banks of North Carolina, where homes are literally starting to wash into the sea. And so these things that we talk about as climate change indicators are not projected in the future. They're starting to have actual impacts. So again, not necessarily MS4 related, but an example of what the future looks like and what are we going to do with it. So you can see these homes obviously were not built within feet of the tide here. And some of these homes are literally washing away. And they've done projections. Now, these barrier islands that we have on the East Coast, they drift and kind of move all the time. But we are seeing a steady progression forward and inland. So as we talk about sea level rise in the future, what are the impacts, again, not only on private property and public assets, but we've also built a lot of our infrastructure purposefully in these areas at the low point of the collection systems and what the impacts are going to be. And so right now, homeowners are literally jacking their houses up and moving them blocks back from the sea. So they're bearing the cost of moving them several blocks back. So I was down there last summer, and this is what you see. They jack them up there, they take them a few blocks back because the alternative is to pretty much lose your home. At some point, if this becomes widespread enough, I don't know that we're going to expect individual homeowners to pay this cost. I think that will transfer more onto an emergency recovery type situation. So what are we doing about it, and what are our thoughts for it? You know, now that we've identified the things that we think are challenges, One of the approaches that we've taken, and we just put this out this year as well, is long-term stormwater planning. And this is a voluntary initiative that is a subsidiary of our integrated planning program. And so in 2012, we released the integrated planning framework, which basically said you can meet your NPDES permit obligations by balancing wastewater and stormwater needs and what projects made sense to you the most and what gave you the most benefit in that order. What we realized too was that some communities didn't operate an MS4, maybe it was a utility, I'm sorry, a POTW, maybe it was a utility, and they were like, how do I use integrated planning to my advantage and make the most of that? And what we've done is really focus on this long-term stormwater planning. And the difference with that is, as opposed to doing trade-offs between your POTW and your MS4, we want you to think of your MS4 and how it can be integrated into the other community projects that you're doing. What are your DOT projects? What are your redevelopment projects? We really want to break down silos, be deliberate about how we plan those projects to really help provide multiple benefits and address some of the costs, right? We would prefer that people not do, if not absolutely necessary, just stormwater retrofits. Fit those retrofits into other urban renewal projects, make those a marginal cost on top of a larger capital cost, and that'll help defray some of the large costs that we anticipate in the stormwater program. We piloted this in a couple of communities to really see what it looked like on the ground. And one of the things that was really interesting for us is we did a site suitability analysis where we would kind of locate through GIS mapping where your prime opportunities were for locating green infrastructure, because it's not going to perform the same everywhere within the communities, and where were your best opportunities to take advantage of that. But really, the other key thing to this is we realized, just like CSO long-term control planning took decades, a lot of MS4 work is going to take 10, 15, 20 years perhaps. Our permits are 5 years. And that was the point I forgot to add about the Clean Water Act. The optimism in that was that they gave us a regular cadence to reissue permits and redo our tech-based limits, because they had this faith that technology was going to keep improving, that we were going to issue permits that were more productive over time, and eventually we were going to meet our Clean Water Act goals. We realize at times that 5-year time horizon can be challenging for folks that want to plan on longer time horizons. So we, just like the CSO program here in MS4s and long-term stormwater planning, want to give communities a broader window of time when they need it. You know, identify the projects that you're going to do on a certain cadence, and we'll figure out how to get that into a permit on a sequence that works for you. The other program that really complements long-term stormwater planning is our green infrastructure program. Our green infrastructure program is just over 15 years old. Robin DeYoung will be up here in 3 months, probably when it's not as pleasant outside, to talk with you all. And she leads our green infrastructure program and our integrated planning program. And they are getting ready to re-release. We did a number of strategic agendas in the teens. We haven't updated in a while. So she's getting ready to release a 10-year strategy. So she's going to call it the 2035 agenda, which is hard to believe that's 10 years from now. But that's what she's got. And it's focused on these 4 pillars. And that's really equity-focused resources and support, how we can further green infrastructure implementation to support our regulatory programs, using green infrastructure for multiple benefits. I think folks are fairly well versed in that now. When I started at the LID Center back in 2004, we were really on a sales and marketing campaign at that point. You know, here's what we're seeing. And I think there's been just a sea swell of change in how people think about it and how creatively they're using it since that time. And then the last is connecting communities to funding and financing. One of the ways that we're doing that is Robin also heads what we call our Green Infrastructure Federal Collaborative. That's 20 different federal agencies that use green infrastructure, or some refer to as nature-based solutions. There's different monikers for it. I think we don't lack for jargon in the MS4 realm. But we have them at the table, and there's 2 main purposes for that. One is so that we can dialogue about all the different things that are going across the federal government and what their priorities are and what their policy keys are, so that we can align those to the best of our abilities. Different statutory authorities sometimes make that hard, but we want to connect as many things as possible. I will say we certainly recognize that while we run a water quality program, water quantity in a lot of communities is a much more pressing issue. So we are happy to align a lot of the work that gets done with some of the things that we need to do as well. But then there's also redevelopment policy, there's housing, there's FEMA, there's a lot of other agencies that have these goals around nature-based or green infrastructure. So we want to make sure we're as closely aligned at the federal level as we can. And then we also want to hook people up with funding that's available from different agencies. And perhaps, and I know navigating federal funding isn't always the easiest road, but we can at least map out where it's available. And some agencies actually have, much greater sums of technical assistance and funding than we do. But we want to make sure that folks are aware of that. So we're trying to make that as user-friendly as we possibly can. And then I think probably our most recent announcement is that Congress authorized and then appropriated funding for Stormwater Centers of Excellence. So this is a brand new thing that we just stood up this year. And we announced that there were 5 recipients of this grant. So this was $5 million in new congressional funding, recognizing that there was a need for additional research, but then also getting that research out to the practitioners. So the 4 centers here, and all these folks are, collaborating with, other teams and other universities, some of which may be sitting here in the room today. But we just listed the primary list on here. And they're going to be standing up these centers, and they're working through the work planning process with our grant officers now, but we just announced them, I think, in July. Yeah, that's right. And then the Center for Watershed Protection is going to run a clearinghouse. They got a portion of that funding to take all the good work and then make it available in a widely distributable way. And then lastly, I just wanted to kind of leave, this is my last slide. I wanted to kind of talk about what this looks like when it all comes together. A lot of these concepts around green infrastructure, long-term stormwater planning, multi-benefit solutions. This is a picture I picked in Atlanta. It's one of many that could have been chosen out of the great work that's being done in the field. But this was a neighborhood that historically the residents that are in this community have kind of been pushed into the low-lying, less desirable, floods often area. So this community was flooded out in 2002 to the extent that the city determined that they were just going to purchase 60 homes rather than try to repair them and have them flood again. So this is Vine City area of Atlanta. This is a 15-acre park that they started planning in 2012. They finished in 2021. This provides fabulous stormwater benefits. Those water features can retain 10 million gallons of stormwater. There's infiltration, there's bioretention areas that, do stormwater quality management as well. There's trees or green space to address urban heat island. But one of the best things about it, it provides an amenity for a community that had historically been underserved. There's recreation space, there's, playgrounds, there's, basketball courts, there's all sorts of things over this 15 acres. This is the holistic type of project that we're really trying to catalyze when we think about this thoughtfully, right? And it provides all the benefits. The community knows that they've got this great amenity. They also designed it to relieve some of the pressure on the sewer system when it does rain. One of the great things is I don't think there are too many people that think about their sewer systems on a daily basis and think, oh, those pipes underground are really, nailing it today. They're, managing that water. But when they fail, they know it. And that's the metric upon which we're measured, right? We're measured upon failure, not so much success. But, when they look out their windows and they see this type of amenity, this really checks all the boxes, right? Community that historically hadn't had investment, climate resiliency, flooding, water quality. This is really what we'd like to catalyze and provide the space for. We run a regulatory program and we will faithfully execute that, but we want to make sure that there's flexibility within that program to allow the creative minds and the researchers to put all this together into projects that look like this. So that was kind of the arc of what I wanted to talk about today. So thanks for kind of bearing with me, and I'm happy to turn it over for any questions.
Thank you, Chris. So Chris has time to answer some questions. First, we'll take a question from the audience. Any question? Mike Trojan.
I'm always asking questions. I was hoping somebody else would raise their hand. But, since you work for a regulatory agency, you talked about long-term planning. I'm curious what role you see for regulatory tools such as zoning in the future, so that we stop building stupid things like communities that are prone to mudslides, or like you showed in the Outer Banks. Is there a role for regulation?
So we don't get into land use. That's outside of our authority. But where we see there being flexibility within our regulations is talking about the cadence and sequencing of projects. So one of the ways, especially within the MS4 program, when we develop permit limits, and what we're using kind of as an analog is our CSO control policy. We knew for a number of years that they weren't going to be meeting water quality standards because you had these massive 2-decade-long infrastructure investments. And the way we could write permits for those communities was basically put in a schedule of projects. You know, in the first 5 years, you're going to build this. The next permit's going to kind of look like this. So what we envision for long-term stormwater planning is you've got a lot of work to do on water quality. We know in the first 5 years, you're not necessarily going to, you know, get it all. But develop your long-term control plan. It's all kind of, I'm sorry, not long-term control plan, your long-term stormwater plan. Tell us what you think through your modeling and the, you know, analytic work that you do, what projects you need to implement to make progress along that stormwater arc. And then we'll start breaking that into the permit chunks that we need. And we can write those in as permit conditions, like on a project and performance basis, as opposed to like an effluent basis. So that's how we kind of see that moving forward.
Okay, we have an online question.
Yes, we have a new question online. So Chris, you mentioned that bioinfiltration effectively removes pollutants from the system. How are agencies working to ensure that pollutants aren't passed through to groundwater? And how are we considering the overall volume impacts of infiltration to downstream water bodies if infiltration connects to shallow as opposed to deep groundwater?
Good question. One of the things that I didn't mention that we just recently posted was a stormwater groundwater webpage that specifically looks at some of the considerations for siting green infrastructure and other stormwater control technologies that infiltrate. When I mentioned the site suitability analysis for the long-term stormwater planning that we did, we recognize that in urban areas, you don't want to infiltrate every type of stormwater everywhere. So you want to have considerations of where you have drinking water supply wells, where you have more shallow aquifers. Obviously, industrial stormwater is a little bit different animal than municipal stormwater, so you want to take a look at those type of things. So we did, because we knew this was a concern in a lot of communities, just publish some of our best information on that online. So if you just look at if you Googled, I didn't include the link, so I apologize for that, but EPA, stormwater, groundwater, it's a brand new page that we have that should pop up for that.
Another question from in-house?
Paula Kalinowski. So I'm thinking as we work to green our cities for stormwater benefit, we're also facing climate change, changes in vegetation. And I know one of the regulatory concerns that we've had is how do you ensure that vegetation is going to be healthy, you know, as we move through these changes. So I'm just wondering, you know, how you're thinking about that at EPA right now and dealing with wanting to green, but also knowing that the vegetation itself is impacted by the changes that we're facing. So
yeah, it's a great question. I want to kick it to Andy because he was talking me through some of the research that they're doing on this. But no, in all honesty, it's something that I think we do need more research on, because when you look at some of the plant species that have typically lived in our communities, they're migrating out, right? And I think we have a little bit of thought about that. We've always encouraged native plantings in a lot of areas for sustainability reasons. And I know that's kind of a changing dynamic, especially I think here a little bit more so than where we are in the mid-Atlantic when we look at some of the data. Like some of the progressions you see, like the Great Lakes area is going to look a little bit more like the Southeast coast, which is kind of crazy when you look at the species that are going to thrive. It is one of the things that we want to have a lens on when we go forward, just for that long-term viability. Andy was describing to me yesterday some of the soil mixes that help propagate plants and also minimize the discharge of some of the nutrients that are needed to grow those plants. So those are some of the things we're balancing as well. And the other point that I really do want to stress too, and I often forget to mention this explicitly when I talk about green, is we really look at infrastructure as in totality, right? So gray has a critical role. What we know is it's just very static. So once we build tunnels or things like that or pipes, they're kind of fixed, at least for a set point of time. We really want to augment our infrastructure with the right tool. You know, what's the right balance of gray and green? how does smart infrastructure technology play a role in that? You know, how do you make your system, your sewer system smart to hold water back in this system, especially if you have microbursts, it's raining in one part of your city, but not the other. So we want to explore all these different ways. We realize it's going to look different in some communities. One of the reasons we talk a lot about green is because of the multi-benefits, but also because it can round out gray. Like if you built your, you know, your infrastructure system for a certain size storm, it's really hard to go back and dig that back up. But maybe if we can retain some water on the surface, slow it down, you can get the same functionality of that infrastructure, that gray infrastructure.
Okay, online.
Yes, the next question is, here in Minnesota, we've done some important stormwater research and technology transfer work. I promise I did not put this question down. Important stormwater research and technology transfer work that should have national impacts. The work on street sweeping to quantify and credit nutrient removal, and finding that a substantial portion of our constructed stormwater ponds are phosphorus sources come to mind as examples. Can you please tell us whether and how EPA plans to help convey information about this work to thousands of other local stormwater programs and MS4 permittees around the United States?
Thank you. I feel like you've given me a good opportunity to plug another product that we have. One of the other things that we have done, we have released a series of stormwater compendia where we actually look at other states, the type of permits that we've written. We do a lot of case studies. Our green infrastructure program, our integrated planning programs are all voluntary. We think they're good ideas in the right circumstances. We encourage people to use them, but there's not a regulatory requirement to do so. So what we try to do is information share a lot. And we're always looking for good examples. You go to our green infrastructure webpage, it has a lot of examples there. We have compendia of permit conditions that have encouraged this and case studies of how those have been used. One of the things that's always been interesting, and I think this is just human nature, when we take one community and we express to another how well it's worked somewhere else, some of the initial reaction is, that's not going to work here. And one of the things that was a big challenge when we started doing green infrastructure back in the early part of the 2000s was, it was like the usual cast of suspects. It was Seattle, it was kind of the Chesapeake Bay, and you would go to different parts of the country, and they'd be like, I don't want to hear about that. That's not our community. They're kind of unique. Fortunately, we've progressed in the sense that we've got it all over now, and we even have it in the Southwest where it's green infrastructure, but it's not green, right? It functions that way, and that's great on the uptick. I don't think we ever anticipated the rapidity with which this would be brought up, but we are very interested to share stories and successes, and even the things that aren't as successful, because we need to learn that way as well. And that's one of the things that we are very committed to, and just part of our program is not necessarily, you know, people always would say to us like, well, what happens if it doesn't work and we invest in it? They're very concerned about our compliance side, right? On this, we want to share that risk with you. We understand that this is an imperfect science, whether it's going to be imperfect. They're hard systems to operate. They're passive. They stand by a lot of times. But if you want to make those investments and show a commitment to doing the thing, we'll do adaptive management as we go. We know it's not going to work the way we thought it is at day one. So we've got every permit term, we're going to check in. How is it doing? What do we need to modify? That doesn't mean that you're going to have a compliance problem at the end of your 5-year term. If you've kind of kept that cadence, that's the expectation.
Okay, in-house. Yeah, here. Give your name.
Randy,
You'll get your chance, you know.
Randy's a panelist. He's not.
My question has to do with, as an MS4, impaired waters, TMDLs, and the NPDES program is the major vehicle for achieving those. Currently in Minnesota, we have a 2045 date to achieve those TMDLs. I'm also aware that Chesapeake Bay, you raised Chesapeake Bay, just to, issued a report, the EPA, that they're not going to make their deadline. My question is the issue of time and consequence. What EPA is talking about internally relative to Chesapeake Bay and what the next step is it patience or whatever, and what that means for Minnesota and 2045 deadline.
Well, I'm grateful I'm not part of the TMDL program, so I can't answer the entire question for you. But what I can talk about a little bit is what we've seen in the Bay. And yes, we're not going to hit the deadline for 2025 next year. I think there's been, in some areas, very significant progress. In the areas where we're still struggling is stormwater and some ag runoff as well. And it's unique because there's 6 states in the Chesapeake Bay, and they all have different relationships with the bay, you know, because some are way upstream. I grew up in Maryland. You know, we put Old Bay on everything because of that. You know, there are just certain things that we look at as part of the bay, as that's part of our ethos, right? You get into Pennsylvania and New York, they feed into that watershed, but it's not their backyard. So there's a lot of different types of collaboration amongst the states to get there, and we recognize that there are significant challenges to get there. I can't speak specifically to the 2045 deadline for Minnesota. What I can say is when we get the right tools in place, we really struggle in places where we don't have TMDLs or listed, and we can't do the pollution budget that we need to, right? Once we get the TMDL in place, we now know who's responsible for what. That non-point source ratio, it allows a lot more market flexibility in the ways that you get those. We think once you get that in place, you have a lot more opportunity to be successful in achieving those goals, as opposed to some watersheds that are impaired that haven't done that work yet. So I can't speak specifically about what it looks like when we're not all the way there, but we think it's once you get the tools there, you've got a lot greater chance of success, even if you don't get 100% of the way there. And then we just have to kind of evaluate as we go. And, you know, are people kind of holding up to what their requirements are? And then what's the performance we're seeing? Because we understand, especially, it's easy to measure a POTW, a little bit harder to measure an MS4. So we just have to kind of figure out the performance and capabilities of that.
Okay, online.
The next question is, do you anticipate the recent Chevron doctrine ruling might have an impact on the NPDES program? And if so, how?
Yeah, we've been getting this question a little bit over the past couple of weeks. And the answer that I give is when we get a ruling that kind of redirects 4 decades of precedent, we have to take a step back and kind of take a beat and kind of assess it. So we've got a lot of lawyers at the agency that take a look at that. The other way I talk about too is it really has more to do with the judicial review process of our regulatory actions than what we do in-house. It's going to be the deference we as an agency are given on our rulemakings. The court did encourage people to only apply this going forward, the change in Loper Bright. We'll wait and see if that actually happens. We, you know, will continue to do what we do, and that's follow the science, adhere to the law on the rulemakings that we have. When we get challenged, we won't be given the expert agency deference that we had going forward. So I don't have an exact answer yet, but that's, you know, kind of the pause that we're taking now and thinking about that.
Okay, and the Chevron doctrine ruling is?
It's ironic. In 1984, NRDC filed suit against an air rule that involved Chevron. And what the court at that time decided was that it was permissible to take a look at the expert agency that had promulgated a rule or regulations and give them deference if there was ambiguity in the statute. If the law doesn't speak exactly to that, there was room for the agency to use the rulemaking process through EPA and everything else to, I don't want to say interpret, but to actualize that statute. What Loper Bright said was, nope, that's part of the judicial review process. We can evaluate what the agency has done on equal footing with everybody else. So the Chevron test was a 2-part test. It said, is the statute clear and unambiguous? If it was, the statute governs. If there's ambiguity, next step was to look at the expert agency. That 2-step process is no longer part of the judicial review process.
Thank you. Another question from in-house. I guess here we have.
Hi, at the human and neighborhood level, is there awareness being built from maybe, you know, stormwater centers of excellence to bring a higher awareness to adopt a storm drain built right here in St. Paul?
One of the things, and I think it's a great question. I think the crux of your question is how do we engage the communities and the people that really are impacted by the work that we do and maybe don't, you know, have and shouldn't have to think about on a daily basis, right? Folks have a lot going on. One of the other tools that we put out recently was our Stormwater Smart series of communication tools that we want people to be able to use and just download directly from our website, because public education and engagement is part of the MS4 program. And really just making people aware of the impact of their daily activities on what goes down the drain and the storm drains. And so we've published those in English and in Spanish. We encourage people to use them liberally, download them. We want them to be passed around to help engage communities. But I think the broader question you're talking about is like, how do we communicate to our communities in a way that's meaningful to them? And I think what has happened, and we're all, we all go through some professional training and we all get tied up in the jargon and we, drop MS4 and we all know what we're talking about and there's 50 of us in the room that mean it and know what it means. My parents don't. So, I have to talk to them differently, right? But one of the things that really struck me is, watershed is a term that we don't think about twice. Over 50% of people think watershed is an actual shed, that they don't understand the concept of a watershed. Because why would you think, like in the old days, you used to have like a shed on your property that was where you drew your water from. So I think the language in which we communicate, it does us a great amount of good to step back from us talking to each other and think about how we talk to a broader audience. We were fortunate enough several years ago to just happen upon a communication specialist and we brought her on board. And she's done all of our outreach materials because the language we use to talk to communities is very different. So when we talk about this park, you don't go in and talk about, well, we changed the hydrograph and, we shaved off the peak and all that. People shouldn't have to care about that. What we talk about is look at what we're able to bring to your community. It's got these great water recreation facilities. It's got splash parks in here and stuff like that. So I think that's really key. And then you engage them on the role that they play. And that's what some of our materials go toward. But that's something that I think when we are looking at our program, thinking about how we communicate the importance of our program, all the work that we do doesn't really have the import if people don't value it. And we can talk about the progress that we're making, but if they don't see the value, they can't support it, and they can't, talk to their people that are the decision makers and the people that spend the money about why it's important to build these projects.
Welcome back to the Minnesota Stormwater Seminar Series. My name is Andy Erickson, and I'm so honored and grateful to be able to host this seminar and moderate our panel discussion. We have a great presentation that teed off our topic. I'm going to start by introducing each of our local experts, although we have one not so local expert as part of our panel today, but I'm going to ask for their relation to the topic as we go. So I'm going to start at the far end, my right, your left. Our first panelist is Seth Brown. Seth Brown has actually been a Stormwater Seminar Series keynote deliverer on this series, and we're so happy to have him back as a panelist because his experience and knowledge in this area is profound. So Seth is the executive director for the National Municipal Stormwater Alliance, among other things. Seth, from your experience and background, how do you relate to today's topic?
I guess I don't know how I don't relate to it. Maybe I should define it that way. No, with the organization that I help to lead, which is comprised of state organization leaders such as Randy and Neprash and MCSC, and we represent 26 of those across the country. I mean, our job is to work with Chris and which has been great at the national level to understand, to take all the great things that you heard that's going on from EPA and the perspectives there and bring them down to the state and local level so that we can have this information transfer that oftentimes, it's stormwater is such a fragmented sector that that information doesn't get out to a lot, especially the communities that really need them, small and mid-sized communities that aren't part of the conversation. So I think our job is to help to be that bridge of information between those two. So I could go into more, but I know that we're just kicking things out, but that's the main thing we want to do is to be able to communicate information from the national level down to the local level to make it relevant at the local level.
That's great. Thank you, Seth. And that actually leads very well into our next panelist. Next to Seth is Randy Neprash. Randy is affiliated with the Minnesota Cities Stormwater Coalition and Neprash Consulting, LLC. Randy, from your perspective and experience, how do you relate to today's topic?
So in a multitude of ways. And so the challenge for me is to always limit how many topics I'm going to address. Because if I try to cover them all, Andy's going to drag me off stage and never invite me back to be on a panel. So I would pick two. out of all the wonderful things. And I do want to say how much it should be appreciated. Chris's presentation, SAFL doing this entire seminar. It is a rare and wonderful thing to talk about national stormwater policy. It hardly ever happens, which is worth noting all by itself. It's also a wonderful thing that there are so many people in the room, but more importantly, online. And this is one of the biggest and most diverse audiences of any seminar that's ever been presented here today, which is cool and important. So the two things that I would pick out would be one, dealing with localized flooding from intense rainstorms. Cities have a really important and long-standing role in addressing all that is not well understood at the federal level. And the federal programs, oddly, are structured to not be able to support and provide much technical assistance for cities in dealing with this. FEMA addresses coastal flooding. They address riverine flooding. They literally and explicitly do not address flooding due to rainfall. NOAA is doing some great work, but they don't know much about what cities do or what cities need. EPA is their authority in dealing with local stormwater is in the Clean Water Act, which is a water quality statute. And it's a stretch for them to deal with water quantity. The other topic that's especially near and dear, and I think particularly important, is the need for something like NMSA. I mean, you've heard about a wide range of really challenging and important issues. They're really complicated. They require long-term effort to address. And a lot of that work is done at the local level, and there needs to be a voice at the national level to address those questions. It needs to be focused on stormwater, not drinking water, not wastewater, but actually stormwater. It's helpful to have the perspective of the cities, and it's important to have the knowledge that the cities have. We've thought for a number of years what was needed was a stakeholder group of permitted cities at the national level. We've tried to do that with NMSA. It's turned out to be harder than we thought, and it's still a challenge, and we've got a ways to go, but it's incredibly important.
Very good. Very good. Thank you, Randy. Our next panelist is Nicole Blasing, who's the director of the Municipal Division at our Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. So Nicole, from your perspective and experience, how do you relate to the topic today?
So thank you for having me. And so I relate to the topic. I'm the director of the Municipal Division. The MPCA is delegated within the state of Minnesota to implement the NPDES program. Within the Municipal Division, we have wastewater and stormwater permitting. So we issue the MS4 stormwater permit, construction stormwater permit, and then also develop the stormwater guidance manual.
Very good. Thank you, Nicole. Our next panelist is James Wisker, who's the district administrator for the Minnehaha Creek Watershed District. James, from your experience and perspective, how do you relate to today's topic?
Yeah, I actually got asked on break how I got roped in into the panel. So it's a good question. I feel a little bit of maybe an odd one out here on the panel, outmatched and outgunned, but we've got a unique watershed perspective. I think at the table here, we've got national and state city perspectives. We've got federal and state policy perspectives from the EPA and the Pollution Control Agency. And as a watershed district that covers 178 square miles of the West metropolitan area, it covers 29 different communities and 120 lakes and streams, including a ton of iconic resources that define our region. We're really operating directly at the interface with cities, implementing all of these policies and rules. And I think it's important to acknowledge, I think this might have come up in presentation, water really doesn't know boundaries. It doesn't know our municipal boundaries. And so that holistic watershed perspective and integrated planning that Chris touched on is one of the ways I relate to the topic and why I'm here, I think.
Very good. Thank you, James. And I hope you can recognize from our panel, I won't have Chris ask or answer the question of how he relates because he gave us the keynote, but I hope you can see from the panel that the intent here was to bring perspectives from multiple levels. So we have the municipal level, we have the state level, we have the watershed district level, which sometimes is within the state and sometimes can span several states. So that watershed perspective is also a very unique perspective when we think about stormwater policy. So I'm going to start our panel with this question, and it's about challenges. And so from each of your kind of unique perspectives, I would like you to give me one or more challenges related to stormwater policy, either at your organization or at the level that your organization sits within this system. And anybody can start.
Come on.
Good.
Randy, you're good with challenges.
I don't know if he's good with challenge.
I was still working on which one to pick off. I'll pick funding. Yes.
That was a popular one.
This audience knows better than to encourage me. Cities fund themselves. Here in the state of Minnesota, we have more stormwater utilities in absolute numbers than any other state in the country, which is a wonderful and remarkable thing. We get some funding support from the state. There is some funding support from the federal level, but it's always really been too little and not sufficiently focused. So we look to the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, CWSRF program, which is the principal source for possible stormwater funding. And yet we look at the history of that program, and less than 2% of CWSRF funding has gone to stormwater projects. Even when we look at the most recent 5-year period in the data that was provided to NMSA, that funding level is less than 4%. And that's lower than it should be. But we really don't know exactly what to do about that. That's partly a question to EPA. It's also partly a question to Congress. And it's a good example of the need for advocacy at the national level to Congress on stormwater issues, which is one of the things that NMSA is trying to work on.
Other challenges.
Well, I guess I'll follow Randy, because funding I do know is a challenge, and something that I'll just kind of piggyback on that, saying that, you know, that is a known challenge and something that we discuss and work on. And one specific challenge linked to that is climate resiliency, and knowing, kind of tying into the dealing with excess water and flooding. We have a climate action plan in the state with a priority to invest in resilient communities throughout the state. And over the past 2 to 3 years, the state has provided over $100 million in grant funding for investing in climate resiliency, climate resilient projects for communities. And so we have been at the state level working to try to advocate for more funding where we know there's a need. And that climate resiliency grant program, which I know just closed a $35 million for stormwater implementation grant program. And we're going through finalizing and awarding those grants right now. And we have more to come in the coming year. And so, yes, funding is known and something that we support, having conversations and continuing to work on that, not only for climate resiliency, but beyond that, through the state revolving fund. I also want to encourage in the Clean Water Needs Survey, when we are working on that and working with you all throughout the stormwater community to get information to fill out the Clean Water Needs Survey, that is a really good avenue for us to really show what the need is, not only at the state, but at the federal level for stormwater infrastructure needs. And so that is, an avenue, is something that we'll be continuing to work with you on into the future and trying to help to communicate the need. So funding, climate resiliency, And then also tying into kind of what Chris talked about, the emerging contaminants at the state level, and PFAS implementation is another thing that we see as a challenge and something that we have been spending and will continue to spend more time on into the future.
Good, James.
All right, thanks, Seth. I think, I guess to quote one of the Stoics, I think the challenge that I see, or the obstacle, is actually the way. And it's one of the things that really jumped out from Chris's presentation is the challenge is partnership, collaboration, and integrated planning. I think to just go back and set the frame for the audience and folks online, the Minnehaha Creek Watershed District, again, we cover a really large region. We have 29 communities, a lot of iconic resources. We've got the chain of lakes, which defines the Minneapolis park system. We've got a 50-foot waterfall in the middle of the city, which receives almost 900 visitors annually. And so we really believe that water defines place, and we've made it our mission to integrate water into city building. And that's hard. That's integrated planning. And that's what Chris was really talking about. It's needed to address water quality. It's needed to address climate impacts. It's needed to defray those embedded costs that we have with recovery. So we're always thinking about what are the goals of our partners in transportation, community development, infrastructure, and how do we bring value to those goals through unlocking the potential of stormwater management. We spend a tremendous amount of time thinking about local community context, where development's happening, transit, and what problems need solving at a community scale. And that's hard. I think the challenge at the policy level, at city government, at state government, at watershed level, is all of those different disciplines, for sake of simplicity and planning, have been separated. And it's really hard to put them back together. Water usually exists separately and away from community development, housing policy, transportation, parks and open space, yet all of the precedent examples that we see in presentations like Chris's, the ones that I give, are where we've defined place, and water isn't necessarily the feature, but it's unlocked housing, addressed urban heat island, it's created space, it's catalyzed community development around that space by providing regulatory offsets. And I think that's one of the challenges. Our system's designed in ways that divide disciplines. And so sometimes working alone is actually easier. There's less friction than going out into your different agencies of city government. You have to actually break and bend policy, go against standard operating procedures to form those unique collaborations. And that's even inside one unit of government. Doing that across agencies and at scale at multiple levels is a real challenge. And so I think that that's something that we're really focused on.
Yeah. Well, going last is always dangerous because all the other great answers before, I literally, if you look at funding, climate change, emerging contaminants, and integrate, all those are in my bingo card of things that I need to look at your notes. I know at this point. No, I think the biggest thing, and I totally agree. I mean, so I worked at the Water Environment Federation for 5 years and really focused on wastewater policy and technology. And you're right. I mean, it's not that it's simple. It's not. It's just that it's more siloed, or it's more focused, right? It's not on the landscape. It's behind.
It's better behaved.
Better behaved, unlike you. Exactly. That's a good point. So it is challenging, and that's the fun of it too, though. I think that's why we see different backgrounds. We have scientists and planners and engineers and whatnot. So I think it's challenging, but it's also more interesting that way. But I would say that the biggest challenge from our perspective is making stormwater relevant, and making it, something that is visible and valued. That's probably the biggest challenge. I mean, so many things fall under that. Funding falls under, all these other things that if it mattered, we would get funding for it, right? So I think that's one of the big challenges. And even in the regulatory structure, that's reflected. So Chris works for the Office of Wastewater Management, not for the Office of Stormwater Management, but for the Office of Wastewater Management. So we're like one level below, in the clean water, as Randy talked about. In the clean water world, wastewater gets a lot of funding, and we get less than I can't remember the other sector. We get the smallest. We get the crumbs of the crumbs. Exactly, less than non-point, right? So, and other, I think was the other category that we get less than.
Bad sign when you're.
It's not good when, yeah, I know. I think we're going to teach it less than other anyway.
We'll make that.
We should. Yeah. So I think that's probably the biggest challenge. I think that many things fall under that is just the relevance and value, like what is it? On Capitol Hill, we deal with lawmakers, if you can call them lawmakers, I guess at this point, but lawmakers and staff who don't have a clue what this really means, right? And beyond that, is this something that's good to focus on or not focus on? All of those questions, just the basics at the national level. It's a challenging thing. So I think that's so many things flow from that, but that's the number one thing for us.
Any other challenges from our panel before we take some audience questions?
Taking myself for giving all the good talking points on communication already. But it kind of gets back to Seth's point about how I think especially from the regulatory agency side, folks view us with a certain lens, and it's hard to kind of break through like the purpose of what we're doing. It's all public benefit driven. And I think the points that were made here is, things are siloed specifically for a reason, because I don't know anything about urban planning, right? So I can't speak intelligently about that. But to James's point, like what we do on the water quality side urban planning impacts that. So how do we marry those two topics together? And then how do we share that with the communities in which that live there, the people that live in those communities, to really see the benefit of what we do through what seems like a burdensome regulatory program. And then once you start communicating that better, then maybe you break down some of the funding barriers, or you break down the relevance. People do kind of react quite significantly to sewage and drinking water, because that's tangible to them. Like drinking water, their public health is at risk, and sewage is, just the factor of that too. Stormwater, rain, we start from a premise of rain is good. And then, but too much of it obviously is not. And, folks, I think, connect with the climate change impacts, but that's not always on the water quality side. So I think they all kind of link together, these challenges in some ways.
Yeah, flooding and poop in the water really make people take notice, and that's we're somewhere in between those. Yeah, I agree.
All right, well, let's dive into your questions. What questions do we have for our panel today? We'll take one in person, and we'll go to online. Who would like to start us off? Everybody's scared of our panel, I think.
As they should be.
Yeah, thank you. And this is going to be mostly for Nicole and Chris. And about contaminants of emerging concern specifically. So the state of California has implemented a trash TMDL, really based on a water quality standard of zero trash should be in our waterways, which I think any of us in a municipal environment know that there's no level of BMPs type amount that would ever achieve that. So that's really an impossible water quality standard. There's a concern that when we have PFAS and microplastics, that an equally impossible water quality standard would be implemented. What is really the state or the EPA doing to ensure that we aren't really putting an impossible burden on the regulated MS4s for a water quality standard that could never be achieved?
You want me to take the first run? Yeah. So I mentioned our PFAS strategic agenda that we had out, and there's one commonality amongst all the work that we're doing, is that we want to get as far upstream as we possibly can. We realize that there's PFAS in MS4 discharges. There's pretty much PFAS everywhere. It's in us, it's in the rain. But we have been explicit about, when we listed the two PFAS under CERCLA, we put out an enforcement discretion memo, and I'm using we broadly, this is our enforcement office, that specifically identified that we didn't have an interest in going after, Seth calls them passive receivers. So it's the POTWs, drinking water systems, it's the municipal airports, the firefighters, and MS4s. We realize that you are collectors of this, you're not generating it. We want to have the people treat PFAS that have manufactured it, that use it in their processes, and get as far upstream as we can. When we talk about monitoring, it's really for informational purposes. We need to know where it is in your community. So like, do you have a hotspot there from historic AFFF use that we need to go and remediate soils? Is there something else? But we don't intend at this point to have any criteria in MS4 permits that are going to hold you for that, because we know that you have received that PFAS. You're not, generating it. We do have challenges on other, on wastewater and drinking water, because if we know what's in those sources, we've got to figure out a way to protect public health. But At this point, what we're looking at as far as levels are concerned, as far as who's responsible for it, our monitoring is really just to figure out, is it uniform across the community? Is it in different areas? We've implemented this on some of the DoD facilities that we permit just for those purposes because it's uneven. And sometimes it's not only in the soils, it gets in the collection system and then kind of bleeds out for years to come because it's kind of coated the pipes. We're still at that kind of information gathering stage. So that's the approach that we're taking. It's going to be very stepwise.
Can I ask, I'm sorry, real quickly, but when you're collecting information, there's, I think, what I'm guessing, I'm not sure, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you're collecting information to take action at some point, right? So whether that's rulemaking or whatever, is that true? Or I mean, what's the follow on for that? Because it could be like, oh, we just learned that there's not as much, or it's some, like it may be action, may not be action. Is that, I'm just kind of curious, like, perspective here.
We have a couple of dedicated actions already, right? So we're looking at 3 effluent guidelines that, PFAS manufacturing is going to be first, then we've got metal finishing, and then we've got landfills. We're going to do an industry study of textile mills, and then we're also doing the POTW influence study, right? We are trying to hone in on where this is, and everybody knows the challenge with PFAS is it's everywhere, right? And it's not only coming out of industrial sources, it's coming out of the clothes we wear, the products that we use in our home. So even if we can reduce down on the industrial side, we still expect to see it in levels coming into POTWs. We have to figure out, what order of magnitude are we talking about? How far do we have to go? Like, we talk to a lot of utilities. They're like, we are not going to solve this until we get to product substitution. And maybe we get there, but we don't know yet. What we know is that it's coming out of, there's about 12 industries that EPA has identified. We're very much focused on controlling it at the sources there, doing product substitution for the AFFFs at this point. And then DoD is handled in a separate lane from this. But our whole thesis, if you haven't had a chance to look at our strategic agenda, I would encourage it because we do really recognize who's responsible for it. And that's who we want to be responsible for the cleanup as well.
Okay, so at the state level, so I mean, great question because a lot of conversation is had around this, especially because within the municipal division, we work with both wastewater facilities and permitting and stormwater. And so the concern is there across the board. And for the state of Minnesota, we've taken a similar approach to that EPA at the federal level has, where we released our PFAS blueprint in 2021 that introduced our strategic approach, which was to prevent first, treat, and clean up where we are to find contamination that has impact to human health that exists. And so we have put at the state level a lot of effort into that prevention piece, which is our #1 priority. We did shortly after release our PFAS monitoring plan. I think it was in 2022, and we've been implementing that since then. And the purpose behind that was to collect baseline samples across all media, air, water, land within Minnesota to get a general understanding of what is the baseline or current level of PFAS in our waste streams moving through our waste management systems, and to identify if we find those hot spots that do have immediate human health concern, that we can focus and we can address those. But really where we're at is that we want to have the information available to really put the effort into that source reduction and prevention, and making sure that the ones, as Chris said, that are accountable are held accountable to reduce PFAS and get it out of our waste management system to the extent possible. I think we say, the PFAS is in the products that we use every day, and the PFAS problem that we have is a result of decisions that we have made as a society in the past. And I know wastewater treatment plants, stormwater collection systems, they are receiving this from homes, from businesses within their community. And that's really where our efforts and our priority is going first, is to working on how can we reduce the sources and how can we hold the industries accountable. I think it was 2 legislative sessions ago the legislation passed for a mayor's law, and that was really focused on instituting laws to reduce or remove non-essential uses of PFAS in products that are manufactured and sold in Minnesota. And so that really is kind of a testament to where the state of Minnesota is trying to focus first, is to try to get those big sources out and hold those industries accountable. And that's where we will continue, moving forward. We are going to, want to do more monitoring moving forward, and just to understand where PFAS is and where we can focus to try to reduce those sources. But limits, especially for, stormwater MS4, is something that, we're not talking about or considering at this time. We really are focusing on getting those sources identified and reduced and removed.
So I want to chime in just a bit. Liz, it's interesting that a lot of the answers ended up going to PFAS instead of just trash. But it's worth noting that when you start with water quality standards that are based on either zero or extremely low amounts, which is where we're going to end up with PFAS, those water quality standards become the basis for inevitable TMDLs. Everybody's obligated to do them. The TMDLs then have waste load allocations, and those waste load allocations are linked to MS4 permits, and they become permit requirements for municipalities discharging stormwater. And when those water quality standards are so low, those permit requirements become unachievable. And that just puts cities in amazingly tough situations. The PCA has, in the recent past, addressed and written TMDLs for some extremely challenging pollutants. I mean, the two that come to mind are mercury and chloride. And they've been very, for lack of a better term, and this is always dangerous to attribute to a regulatory agency, they've been very creative in how to do that. And they have resulted in TMDLs that are actually workable for the stormwater discharges, which is greatly appreciated. What we've done is to approach the regulators. We've talked with PCA, we've talked a little bit with EPA, saying we ought to start thinking about how to write these inevitable TMDLs so they don't put cities in impossible situations. They use some of these imaginative, interesting approaches. And EPA has approved and enabled those TMDLs with those good approaches. We ought to start thinking about how to do those things for trash and PFAS. And the response, particularly on the PFAS side, the response has been, holy moly, we got our hands full thinking about how to deal with PFAS on the drinking water and wastewater side. And we really just don't have the bandwidth yet to talk about it on the stormwater side, which leaves us concerned and a bit worried. So again, I'm strong on bringing the challenges to the table. I wish I was better at bringing the solutions, but we do want to think more about that and encourage the regulators to think more about it as well.
I appreciate that. And I actually thought that you had a very, very positive, we're talking about mercury and chloride, and that, we as a state have dealt and developed TMDLs for very challenging pollutants. I mean, we have a very restrictive water quality standard in the Lake Superior Basin for mercury, and we've found success on the wastewater side, implementing and achieving those really stringent limits. And I think some of it is how we as a state are willing to and want to work proactively with our stakeholders on the front end, because we want to set things up that will succeed in the end. We don't, we want to really understand what are the constraints and how can we balance the reductions needed to actually be successful in the end. And if that includes, things like trading, water quality trading, or integrated planning, or, I think we're willing to have those conversations and be as creative as we possibly can within the regulatory framework that we implement our programs in. I think we've had success in the past doing that, and we want to keep doing that in the future. And so I think being willing to come to the table and have conversations and really talk about that on the front end to help to build into or feed into the efforts that we're implementing or the TMDLs that we're developing is something that we will continue and want to do into the future, because we want to set things up for success.
Another comment?
James, you got anything on that?
Me?
Yeah.
No.
Okay. You sure?
We talked about that.
Okay. You're right. You're right. I think it's interesting you talk about trash and PFAS because trash is, I would say, one of the easiest or most straightforward pollutants, and yet we still don't have a handle on that, right? Right. And then so PFAS is everywhere, and it's the hardest thing to deal with. So it's just the spectrum right there. No, and I think that you're right. The California trash amendments of zero. I mean, there's a whole history behind that of, I think, insanity, which I think that we don't want to duplicate. And as a national organization, we would say that's not something we want to be attainable, right? We want to be able to do, make sense of things. Before we get to that point, though, in the near term, and Chris talked about this, I think, to a certain degree, I just want to be clear that PFAS has been defined as a hazardous substance, right? And that's April this year. It's pretty recent, in April or May or something like that of this year. So that puts it in the Superfund or CERCLA world, which means that POTWs and communities MS4s are open to third-party lawsuits. And the way this can work and has happened, I believe, and could happen in the future is that, I shouldn't say 3M here, DuPont, something, a company like that, who's being sued may want to say, hey, we're going to defray our risks and we're going to spread this burden around and we're going to try to get others involved with this so that we don't have to pay everything ourselves. The point is that that we could be brought into that in the meter term, which is why the term passive receiver is something that we use, and we're part of a coalition of many other organizations at the national level saying, hey, we're not generators, like Chris has acknowledged that that's the case. However, as Chris, I don't think we've clarified, EPA can't do much about this, right? EPA's got limitations. Their intention is to not go after public works and others for this, but at the end of the day, it is what it is. So that's why, talking about a national organization, what we're focused on is it needs congressional action, federal, because it's a federal program, federal legislation to include protection for MS4s and POTWs and others from third-party lawsuits. There's just no way that EPA can do that. EPA has suggested and said that they don't want to, and that's clear. And I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, but so in the meantime, that's what we're focused on. And when it gets, if and when this gets into the NPDES world, that's, another discussion that we need to continue to have. And I think it's great what we're hearing right now at the state level, that we need to be reasonable. And I think source control has to be, but I think the other thing to acknowledge real quickly is we've been using PFAS for a long time in many products because it is very useful and probably saved many lives because it's, so it's not, we shouldn't. The point is that it's going to be hard to do this, but I think it's something that we need to look at. But I don't see any other way to do this. We can't treat our way out of it because even if we treat it, how do we dispose of it in a way that doesn't reintroduce into the environment? That's a big conversation that's going on in the drinking water sector, for instance, right now. So anyway, do you want to clarify what I said?
Yeah, no, you got it. CERCLA itself is a very broad law intentionally, and they look for responsible parties for cleanups. And so we did, once we listed the two PFAS as contaminants, we put out, and this was our enforcement office, they put out an enforcement discretion memo that basically said, we are not interested in pursuing passive receivers as responsible parties. And to the extent that when we settle out actions against a responsible party, we would try to make, as part of that settlement agreement, terms that they could not bring in other parties into that. So like we settle out against an industrial facility, they then can't turn around and sue the MS4 or the POTW. To Seth's point, if we don't have that agreement, somebody else could bring somebody else in because of the CERCLA defines a transporter of a pollutant. So if you carried it in your collection system, you could be defined as a transporter. We've been very clear. I encourage everybody to look at that memo. That's our intent behind it. We can't bulletproof it, but we can, we put a thumb very heavily on the scale as to who we want to pay those cleanup costs.
I'll just add real very quickly, I promise, that we were, honestly, that there was a couple listening sessions at the federal level that EPA held, and there were probably, I don't know, 30 to 40 groups, drinking water, private water, public water, wastewater, whatever. We were the only MS4 group in that whole room. And so I think to Randy's point about having a group at the national level, this is why it's relevant to have a national group and these conversations, because oftentimes we haven't, and because of the work of frankly Randy and others, they made sure that MS4 was included in the talking points of like things that they had to acknowledge. So I just wanted to mention that.
So there's actually a little more to that story.
Yes,
I may.
there always is.
I know. Office of Enforcement started the CERCLA process, which is different than Chris's office. Is different than the stormwater program within EPA. When they started this process about EPA's enforcement discretion regarding passive receivers, their list was drinking water, wastewater, airports, municipally owned landfills, fire departments,
Farmers, yep.
that received biosolids. And it was kind of obvious that one of the items that was missing from the list was urban stormwater discharges. And in particular, the MS4 permitted stormwater discharges, because there's a component of third-party lawsuit liability that is part of that permit. So we noticed that MS4s were missing, and we brought that to EPA's attention in the listening session. And the good news now is that MS4s are on EPA's list. But as Seth mentioned, EPA's enforcement discretion is only probably less than half the story. There's still the possibility of other lawsuits from other parties, and Congress is working on that. But even as an office within EPA forgot stormwater, so is Congress. And the reason I tell the story is that both pieces of that story serve as examples of how important something like NMSA is, even in just that one relatively simple example. Thanks.
Any other comment? All right, we're going to take an online question. This question actually came in during the presentation, but I wanted to save it intentionally for the panel because I thought it had good relevance from all of our perspectives. So the question here is the STEP program. The STEP program shows a lot of promise for improving water quality through performance testing and verification of stormwater products and practices. What can the EPA do? And if I can expand that, what can we also do locally in our cities and watershed districts? What can we all do to encourage states and local agencies to embrace the program, extend the program, and build upon what the STEP program is meant to do?
Kudos to Seth for giving that question while he sat in the office. Yeah, in the audience. Yeah, that was pretty good. Yeah, so at EPA, we can't necessarily endorse because this is an independent process that Seth has worked on for years to kind of set up with third-party verifiers. We are supportive of it. We've worked as part of this and funded some of this in the very early stages of it. And we think that it's super critical when we talk about how we put stormwater on par with drinking water and wastewater, is looking at the performance of some of these systems and having some verified performance of how these systems are going to operate in the environment. So, we can't necessarily on our webpage say like, oh, you need to use a STEP verified device, but we can point out to the verification process that somebody else is doing as part of what I would say like normalizing the performance and putting it out there. One of the things that, I know NMSA has talked about a lot is how do we bring stormwater on an equivalent table with drinking water and wastewater, just because they had such a head start, right? And I think verification processes like these, performance measurements that are independently run, that can say like, we know we're going to get this type of performance, it helps for all the permit compliance that we do.
Other thoughts?
No, you got to do it.
Oh, I have to do. Well, I want to first clarify that I was in the room when the question about Chevron came online, and I was also in the room when the question about STEP came in. So these are not me asking these questions. Yeah, I mean, for those who we haven't really talked about it that much, but the STEP program is a consumer reports for stormwater infrastructure program that NMSA has established, and we launched in April of this year, focused on trash capture devices, and really, obviously, California is screaming out for that. To your point about trash and the trash amendments, but
Minneapolis too.
And Minneapolis, I hear as well, as Randy says. Yes, thank you. But yeah, I mean, one of the things that that would be really helpful for us, and we're engaged with the Aqua, the Association of Clean Water Administrators, all the state regulators and their stormwater committee to engage with the states to see if there's a ways to provide incentives or recognition for third-party testing, you know, for products. And there's an example in Tennessee. They just included, and I can't remember how they framed it out or how it's done and how it's worded exactly, but there is a requirement that's starting September right now that any products that are used in their municipalities require, if possible, to have third-party testing done. And there are programs out there, and STEP is one that's it's launched and growing. So those are the types of incentives that I think we could look for. EPA can only do so much. Let's be honest, and you know, that's because of the structure of our regulatory program, which is great, which is fine. But EPA has been really helpful in providing recognition on that program. So I think I think we're having a good conversation. I know that we're set up to have a engagement and meeting with all or multiple EPA offices as well as regional offices, because obviously in some region, you know, regional offices have a significant input, especially for those regions like Region 6 that have non-designated states like New Mexico and whatnot, or Region 1 with New Hampshire and Massachusetts, where they're doing regulation directly. And so the EPA plays a strong role there, but there's also a limitation in that. So it really has to be something that we have to show value at the state and local level. And I think we're well on our way, I believe. So anything I didn't cover, Randy? Okay, excellent. John had a comment? No.
So we'll take another in-person question.
Yeah, I feel like you've really been concentrating a lot on the initial part, planning, design, construction, regulatory. I don't hear a lot about operation and maintenance. And as a municipality, I mean, that's really where the rubber hits the road. I guess trying to put that into a question, how do you see your role? What is the future of operation and maintenance, you know, with your roles that you have for your different levels, but also potential funding, or how, you know, I'm looking at pond cleanings. I mean, if we tried to clean all the ponds in Minnesota, we'd have no place to put the material, you know? So I guess leaving it at that, that's kind of a general question. Role in the future of operation maintenance, potentially some inspection and monitoring as well.
Who wants to dive in on that question?
I'm going to take a shot at it. But the end result will be making it worse instead of better, as usual. I mean, O&M is huge, and everybody who knows about stormwater knows that it's all well and good to build the stuff, but you have to take care of it. Sometimes that maintenance is expensive stuff. EPA, this is part of the reason why I'm going first here. EPA struggles with that. And they struggle, I believe, largely because of the statutes that they have to operate under. So there are funding programs. The funding programs specifically apply to construction. They can be stretched a bit to apply to planning for construction, but it's still associated with construction. And until the statutes are changed, I'm curious about your response on this, Chris, until the statutes are changed, that's always going to be an immense challenge. EPA is not going to be able to help much. So that's where the question of being able to advocate with Congress, because they're the ones that have to change the statute. EPA cannot advocate with Congress. EPA can answer questions when they're asked politely or otherwise, but they can't do the advocacy work, which of course will lead to my inevitable comment about the importance of NMSA. But that's part and parcel and where a good bit of the challenge lies.
James, how about O&M for you and you?
Sure. I think a part of Bob's question there is there's just a tremendous focus on new capital investments for new projects to create new benefit. And I think every organization struggles with maintaining a consistent foundational data set of what do we have, where are the maintenance needs, and pumping cash into maintaining that. And we know our stormwater management facilities are only as good as their ability to maintain them. I think something that we've had our eye on for a while as a watershed, watching communities struggle with as they've been required to inventory 20% of their assets each year and bring those onto kind of a maintenance program, is the legacy private infrastructure. For years, we've regulated private development, and there's infrastructure all over the place on land that don't have the right covenants, funding structures that are part of development, homeowners associations. So I think we've thought about a blanket approach to that bridges a regulatory strategy. How do you incentivize those projects coming into the fold where we could inventory them, and then ultimately have a program for maintaining private infrastructure? I don't think we have a clear understanding of how much is out there and what the potential water quality upside or volume storage benefit is from simply reinvesting in the infrastructure that we've built versus building new.
I think the question is great, and the topic is, I'm glad you brought that up because it's huge. I think, our tendency is to want to build new things all the time, right? And we get federal grant funding that's limited to capital investment only, right? And because the thought is, we'll help you build this. Now it's yours. So now you have to, whatever. And I know there's a lot of stormwater utilities in Minnesota, more than any other state, I believe. Is that right? Yep. And still there's a struggle here, right? Think about the rest of the country, So O&M is, it's a huge issue. In many ways, I think that we could almost stop building for a permit cycle or two and just focus on O&M and probably get more cost effective. I didn't say that publicly, but you can almost get more effective, cost effectiveness, in
Since you have no authority.
That's true. That's true. It doesn't matter what I say, even better. I can say whatever. You do. I know. So I think it's a great point, and I think it's something that we need to address. And I think this ties in with the larger question. I don't know if this ties in with the last topic that you want to talk about, is performance overall. And we need to care about perform. We have our STEP program, our stormwater testing program, which looks at how does this product work? How does this practice work today when it's installed? What about 5 or 10 years from now? What's the performance decay? Let's assume that there's very little or no maintenance that's provided, because that's the reality and often case, right? We need to recognize that there's a performance decay, or else what's the incentive, especially because so much of it is on private lands, that we just have to create incentives. I just think that topic is really big. And I think just one small or one way to look at this is there are opportunities or opportunities, maybe approaches like pay for performance as an example, where you can take capital money and you can look at the performance over the lifetime and see if you can wrap up some or maybe all of that O&M into the upfront cost. And there are some approaches where that is being seen as a viable way of getting some O&M costs built into a project upfront, but it's still very nascent and it's not commonly done. I don't know how widely acceptable, but that's something we need to look at as a sector, because unless we get more and more funding to focus on this, and to your point about pond dredging, what about the material that's now considered toxic? That's a whole nother, which anyway, I'm going to leave it right there. I know I made it worse. So anyway.
Not really. I think Randy articulated well the challenges that we have. We know that the issue is there, and the support and the funding for O&M is critical and important, and continued research and guidance development and enhancement, where there's needed for different practices and stuff. And so I think we just need to continue the conversation, but it is difficult, and it's something that everything does get invested in those new BMPs and practices that are implemented, and across even beyond stormwater into wastewater. It's a challenge too there, and I have always said in my career to really think about what technology you're choosing, because O&M long-term is where the real cost comes in over time. And so, even just being mindful about what practice you're choosing to put in, and that it's not only the upfront cost, but it's that long-term cost too, that then gets passed on to the city or the watershed district or whoever's overseeing it. So.
Well, we are quickly approaching the end of our time here. What I'm going to do is first of all, I want to thank everyone that submitted questions online. We will be sharing all of those questions with our speaker and our panelists to give them an opportunity to provide responses and links to resources for those questions. If you have questions in the room that you did not get to ask, feel free to send an email to me, Andy Erickson, and I will add that to the list of questions for our speaker and panelists. But now I want to move into our key takeaways and our closing question for our panel today. And in the key takeaways, what I'd like our panelists to do is either highlight some big lesson learned or big key takeaway that they want to reemphasize for our audience, or if you have something that we didn't get to talk about yet, if there's something that you really want to make a mention of at least, so that it's part of the conversation, and maybe I think clearly we need a part 2 to this discussion. If you want to make a mention of that, then we can carry that over into the next session. So with that, I'm going to close with our key takeaways. I'm going to start again in the same order that we introduced everyone. Seth, what's your key takeaway for today?
I think the key takeaway from our perspective is that stormwater is relatively young. We're a relatively young sector, right? The MS4 program has been around for 30-ish years, depending on, when you go and when you entered in the program. So I would, you said part 2. So I feel like MS4 1.0 is what we're in now. And I think we need to look at an MS4 2.0. And that maybe that could be the next, what's the future of the program? That's something that we're looking at. So, because I think we've highlighted several challenges here and not so many solutions as of that, but just a recognition that we're young and we're struggling and we're maturing. And we're going to be making improvements as we go along, but don't lose heart, don't lose faith. I guess is the thing, because it sounds pretty grim, but I'm trying to be positive. Isn't that positive?
It means it's wide open for where we want to go next, right?
Yes,
We have lots
exactly.
of ways to grow.
Yeah, there's a lot of innovation, a lot of technology, a lot of good things that anyway, I'll stop.
Precisely.
Yep.
Randy, what would be your key takeaways from today's discussion?
Okay. So I'm going to start with one piece that was missed. Chris touched very briefly on the new centers of excellence, which is extraordinarily cool and has the potential to be a real positive step forward. One of the grantees and one of the centers is being led by the University of New Hampshire, but it's worthwhile in this context to mention that 2 of the partners with the University of New Hampshire are the University of Minnesota and NMSA, both of which are extraordinarily cool and worth mentioning.
Yeah.
The other comment I wanted to make to try to close up is my description of stormwater is that it's just not well behaved. Drinking water and wastewater, they've got single streams, you can measure them, they respond well to engineering solutions, and kind of none of that works out easily on the stormwater side at all. We have a BMP-based permitting system nationwide. We don't even know the approximate number of BMPs we have in place, much less the pollutant load reductions that are being achieved by those BMPs. Cities are doing this remarkable work, and yet that's an important story that we cannot quantify and we cannot tell to the public that needs to hear about it, to Congress, to state legislatures. That's important. And those are just huge pieces of policy work that we need to address.
Thank you, Randy. Nicole, what would be your key takeaways?
Okay. My key takeaway is, coming in, I know that there's a lot of challenges that the program has already faced, and there's even more complex challenges moving forward. And just hearing the conversation today, we talk about what those challenges are, and the answers are difficult and complex, or we're at the beginning of figuring out what's the path forward going to be. So my key takeaway is just the importance of us continuing to work together across, from regulatory agency to the cities and watershed districts and the stakeholders, to have a true understanding of what the needs are and working together to define the path forward. And so my key takeaway is just the importance of collaboration and listening to each other and working and finding the right path forward as we're navigating through these really complex issues that we're faced with.
Thanks, Nicole. James, what are your key takeaways?
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. I think we spent a lot of time, we consumed a lot of oxygen on contaminants of emerging concerns. That was a huge takeaway for me. If I were to leave the audience with one takeaway, it's that, water is life. Stormwater is an essential part of building thriving communities and sustainable cities. And it's going to require us to adapt the systems that created the problems in order to fix it. We've got to get outside of our silos, collaborate, and do integrated planning. And I think with all of the challenges, whether they are contaminants of emerging concern or climate change, which we didn't spend as much time talking about, that's going to be absolute paramount. From a watershed perspective, our experience has been climate change is already here. Chris touched on that. We've had the wettest 7 years ever recorded. A flood of record followed by deep drought. And then we're 2 inches off the wettest year ever recorded since 1890 this year. And we've seen those disruptive rainfall patterns really impact the systems that were designed around static patterns. And we're seeing communities that developed early pre-environmental regulation that built their storm sewer systems, eliminated storage and filled wetlands, really feeling the strain, and they have limited options, and they're focusing a lot on the assets they own and control, storm sewer systems. But a lot of the issues need to be solved up in land use, which is really where we need kind of integrated policy and management and planning. We'd like to see kind of a storage first approach to climate change. Conveyance has to be part of the solution, but from our experience, we're already starting to see potential as a watershed organization that spans 29 communities for upstream, downstream conflict. As we get more volume that falls from the sky and that risk is moved between communities, we're being brought in without the regulatory authority to kind of broker those conversations. And I see a couple of our communities chuckling in the audience. We've had those meetings recently. So those are some of my takeaways.
Very good. Thank you, James. Chris, you get the last word. What are your key takeaways today?
Thanks, Andy. And in good anchor-leg fashion, I don't know that I have anything new, but I like to misinform people and say I was in college not that long ago. But I was commenting at some point, like during dinner or something, that what I studied on stormwater management in college is very different than how we're implementing stormwater today. So the pace of change in this field is rapid and it's dynamic. So to the point of other things that we have to regulate that are a bit more static that we've looked at for decades or centuries, this one is young, changing all the time, and the approaches that we are thinking are the best solutions are changing, even within the approaches. Like 20 years ago, Andy was talking me through some of the research they're doing out there about bioretention mixes and what we think is optimal. That's changed in the last decade. So we need to be flexible, we need to be collaborative, and we need to collaborate like across programs with academics to regulators. We need to provide flexibility for folks to try new things, which is always, I know the regulated community loves that phrase. Go ahead and try new things. We'll support you on it. But that's really how we have to approach wet weather, especially considering that we are in a changing climate, and what it looks like in 20 years is going to be very different than now. One of the biggest concerns we do have is about our low-lying assets and how we're going to maintain that functionality. And that's something that's on our horizon while we're also trying to improve water quality. So, I mean, it's a lot of moving pieces. That's always my biggest takeaway when we leave here. I do think that there are a lot of good, smart people working on this that are investing a lot of time and energy. So I'm a bit more optimistic. I can honestly say when I started this, really wholeheartedly 20 years ago, I would have never imagined that we would be at the point in the conversation that we are, where we can sit in a room and everybody's like, yeah, these are the things we need to do. Now it's like, really, how do we optimize implementation? How do we ensure their viability in the long term? How do we, handle the things that we weren't thinking about? But that wasn't even part of the discussion 2 decades ago was like, we think this will work, and now we are putting that into practice. So I do have a bit of maybe naively foolish hope that we will conquer this, but that's still where I think we can go.
That's fabulous. Thank you, Chris, and thank you to our panelists. I do want to thank Chris for setting the topic today, for coming out and letting us talk about stormwater policy at a national and local level due to our local experts. Thank you so much for making this possible. I want to thank you, the audience, for joining us either in person or online and submitting your questions. Again, we will share questions with our speaker and panelists to give them a chance to answer all those we didn't get to ask today. And I encourage you also to check our website for upcoming Stormwater Seminar Series events. In my opinion, at least, we have some very exciting topics coming up. I think it's going to be a great rest of this calendar year, and then we're going to be talking about next year's schedule very soon. So stay tuned for that. Watch online. All of these are recorded. You can find them online on YouTube if you missed past ones. So I encourage you to check that out as well. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to see you at a future Minnesota Stormwater Seminar Series. Thanks so much.
Andy.